It started with my truck disappearing in the middle of the night, and the worst part was that nobody even pretended it was theft. They called it policy, like that made it normal, like it didn't matter that I'd parked in that same exact spot for 3 years without a single complaint. I remember standing there that morning, coffee still warm in my hand, staring at an empty patch of asphalt under the old maple tree, like my mind just refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. And that was the moment I realized something in my life had quietly shifted without anyone bothering to tell me. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm not someone who usually stirs trouble. I fix HVAC systems for a living. I pay my bills. I keep to myself. And I had been renting a small unit at Willow Creek Estates, a quiet-looking apartment complex tucked on the edge of a Midwest town where nothing ever really happens until it does. My truck, a faded blue Chevy Silverado I'd owned since my early 20s, wasn't just transportation. It was routine, comfort, something predictable in a life that otherwise changed too often. And I always parked it under that one tree because the shade kept the paint from baking in summer, and nobody ever told me not to. But that morning, there was a sign where there hadn't been one before, bright white and freshly bolted into the curb like it had always belonged there. Reserved parking, unauthorized vehicles will be towed. And I actually laughed at first because I thought it had to be some kind of joke, some rushed maintenance mistake. But the silence around me told me it wasn't. I walked inside, checked my lease like a man trying to convince himself reality was negotiable. And that's when the first crack showed up, because nowhere in those pages did it say anything about assigned parking enforcement beyond basic lot rules. Nothing about towing authority granted to the HOA that managed the property. Nothing that gave them the right to turn my daily life into a hostage situation. And that was the moment my confusion started turning into something heavier, something sharper. I made a few calls, first the leasing office, then the HOA number listed on a faded flyer in the lobby, then whatever chain of customer service loops they could bury me in, and every conversation felt like being gently pushed down a hallway that kept getting longer, until finally someone gave me a name, Irongate Towing, a company I had never heard of before but would come to understand very well in the worst way. When I called them, the voice on the other end didn't sound angry or even interested, just routine, like they had done this 1,000 times before, and I was simply the next invoice. And they told me my truck was impounded for unauthorized parking enforcement initiated by property management, and if I wanted it back, I would need to pay $3,400 in cash, same day, plus storage fees that would climb by the hour like it was some kind of meter measuring my helplessness. I sat in my car after that call for a long time, engine off, hands just resting on the steering wheel, not because I didn't have the money, but because something about the entire process felt too clean, too rehearsed, like I had just stepped into a system that wasn't designed for fairness, only compliance. Still, I paid it, because what else do you do when your own vehicle is being held behind a chain-link fence you can't legally cut through? And I remember the smell of that impound yard, oil and wet gravel and cigarette smoke. The way the gate clanged shut behind me when I drove out with my truck again like I was being released on permission rather than ownership. I thought that would be the end of it, just a painful story I'd tell later about getting ripped off. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something I didn't fully understand yet. Because once you've been shaken by something that feels unfair, you don't really go back to the same version of yourself afterward. That night, I didn't sleep much. I just kept thinking about that sign. How new it looked, how deliberate. And I started digging not out of anger at first, but out of this slow-building need to understand how something like that could even happen legally. I pulled my lease again, line by line, highlighting sections that suddenly mattered more than they did a week ago. And there it was, buried in plain language that didn't leave much room for interpretation. Tenants were entitled to unrestricted use of designated resident parking areas, which meant the foundation of what they had done already didn't align with the contract I signed. The next morning I went to City Hall, the kind of place that smells like old paper and fluorescent lights, and I requested public records on Irongate Towing and Willow Creek Estates, expecting maybe a misunderstanding, but instead I found something that made my stomach tighten. Irongate had prior violations on record for aggressive towing practices, fines issued in neighboring counties for improper signage enforcement, patterns that suggested this wasn't a one-off mistake, but a repeat behavior that just kept slipping through cracks and oversight. And then I checked state regulations, actual towing statutes, not summaries, not opinions, just black and white legal text. and there it was clearly stated that any enforcement signage must be posted for a minimum notice period before towing can be legally enforced. And my truck had been removed less than 12 hours after that new sign went up, which meant every part of this had been rushed, coordinated, and extremely deliberate. By the time I pieced all that together, the anger had stopped feeling like an explosion and started feeling like something colder, more structured, like I was no longer reacting but mapping. I decided I wasn't going to fight this with noise or emotion. I was going to understand exactly how the system worked, and then I was going to step inside it in a way they didn't expect. I printed everything, every document, every statute, every violation report, and I kept it in a folder that started off thin but grew heavier by the hour, like it was absorbing weight from the situation itself. I remember sitting in my apartment that night, the hum of the refrigerator louder than it should have been, thinking about the HOA board I had never cared about before, thinking about how people like that tend to operate, confident in small authority, convinced that most people won't push back because pushing back costs time, money, energy, and most people don't have all three at once. But I did have time now, and I had something else too, clarity, the kind that comes when confusion finally burns off and leaves a shape behind. The next step was obvious even if it didn't feel comfortable. I was going to attend their next HOA meeting, not as a complaint, not as a request, but as someone holding a record they hadn't expected anyone to assemble. And I had no idea yet how fast the room would change when I walked through that door, or how quickly their confidence would start to unravel the moment I placed that folder on their table. When I walked into that HOA meeting, I didn't announce myself. I just followed the sound of voices down a narrow community room hallway that smelled like cheap carpet cleaner and stale coffee. And the second I pushed the door open, I could feel it. That subtle shift in energy when a space expects control and suddenly loses it. The board was already seated at the front, neat rows, printed agendas, little name placards like they were running something far more official than a suburban parking dispute. And at the center was the president, a man named Richard Halden, dressed a little too sharp for a volunteer position, blazer pressed, watch catching the light every time he moved his hand like even his confidence had accessories. He looked up at me immediately, not curious, more annoyed, like I was a stain on a clean surface. I didn't sit down, I just stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch long enough that people started to notice something wasn't following their script. Richard finally spoke, voice calm but edged. "This meeting is for members only. You're not on the agenda." And I remember nodding slowly, like I was agreeing with him, before I placed the folder on the table in front of him, not aggressively, not dramatically, just firmly enough that every paper inside shifted slightly. "You're right," I said. "I'm not on your agenda, but I think I'm about to become your problem." There's a specific kind of silence that follows words like that, not loud, not dramatic, just heavy, like the room itself is holding its breath, and I saw it happen immediately. A couple of board members exchanging quick glances, someone clearing their throat, another suddenly very interested in their pen. I opened the folder and started with the sign, the one that had appeared overnight. I slid a photo across the table, time-stamped, and I asked a simple question: who authorized this? Richard leaned back slightly, smirk still there, but thinner now. "Property management handles signage. It's standard enforcement procedure," he said, like that sentence was supposed to end the conversation. But I didn't let it. I pulled out the lease next, laid it beside the photo, and then I tapped the exact clause that said resident parking was unrestricted within designated areas, and I said, "So where in here does it say you get to override this?" That's when the room changed, not dramatically, but enough that you could feel it, like someone turned the temperature down by a few degrees. One of the board members, a woman in her 50s with tight hair and tired eyes, leaned forward slightly like she was trying to read the documents without being noticed, and I could see it clicking in her expression, the realization that this wasn't just a complaint, this was evidence. Richard tried to recover quickly, shifting tone into that familiar HOA voice, the one that sounds reasonable if you don't listen too closely. "We act in the interest of community safety and order. Unauthorized vehicles create liability issues." I actually laughed at that, not loudly, just enough to break the tension, because I had heard that exact kind of justification before in different forms, always the same structure, always dressed up like responsibility. "No," I said quietly. "You acted without legal notice, without contractual authority, and you used a towing company with a documented history of predatory enforcement to remove private property. And then I added the part that made the room finally go still. And I've already filed complaints with the state attorney general, city code enforcement, and a local investigative reporter who specializes in exactly this kind of thing. That was the first real crack. Not anger, not denial, just stillness. I saw a couple of faces drop immediately, the way people react when they realize something is already moving beyond their control. Richard tried to interrupt me, but I kept going, because once you've started laying it out, stopping halfway only gives them room to breathe. I explained the towing statute, the 7-day notice requirement, how their sign was legally meaningless the moment it was used immediately, how Iron Gate Towing's prior fines were not just history but pattern evidence. And as I spoke, I could feel the narrative shifting in the room. Like I wasn't arguing anymore, I was documenting. At one point, Richard stood up, trying to reclaim physical authority, hands slightly raised like he was calming a crowd. This is becoming disruptive. We can handle this internally. And that's when I looked directly at him and said, "No, you handled it internally when you towed my truck without notice. Now it's external." He didn't like that word, external, because it implied exposure. And exposure is what systems like that fear more than anything else. The meeting ended shortly after that, not officially, just awkwardly, like a conversation everyone suddenly agreed to stop having at the same time. But what I didn't expect was how quickly the aftermath started. By the next morning, I got a call from the property management office, then another from someone claiming to represent the HOA board, then a very careful voicemail from Richard himself, suddenly much softer, offering to discuss reimbursement options. I didn't respond right away. I wanted them to sit in it for a bit, the uncertainty, the realization that I wasn't going away quietly. 2 days later, the offers got more direct. First a refund of the towing fee, then reimbursement for inconvenience. Then language shifted into settlement terms, like they were trying to convert a mistake into a negotiation table as fast as possible. I refused all of it, not out of pride, but because I could already see what they were doing, minimizing liability, isolating the incident, turning a pattern into a one-time error. That's when I sent my counterproposal, and I still remember how calm I felt writing it, almost detached, like I was drafting terms for a business deal rather than responding to people who had just cost me time, money, and a very specific sense of trust. I demanded $1,000 per day for every day my vehicle had been held, immediate termination of their contract with Iron Gate Towing, and a formal written policy requiring 7-day notice and explicit owner consent before any towing action could ever occur on resident property again. I didn't expect them to agree quickly, but I also didn't expect how fast the fear moved through their responses once legal pressure stopped being theoretical and became structured. Within 48 hours, their tone shifted completely. No more vague language, no more community framing, just direct negotiation. By Friday afternoon, I got the final message. They were agreeing to the terms. I remember sitting there holding my phone, not feeling victorious in the way people expect, more like watching a system correct itself reluctantly under force. The check came out to $9,500, which was more than I had lost, but that wasn't the real point, because the real point was already happening elsewhere. Iron Gate Towing lost their contract with Willow Creek Estates first. Then neighboring properties started asking questions. Then those questions turned into audits. And within months, I started seeing posts online from other residents in other towns describing the same pattern, the same signs, the same overnight enforcement, like someone had pulled a thread and realized it wasn't just one knot. And still, even after all that, I didn't feel like anything had been solved in a grand sense. Because systems like that don't really disappear, they just retreat, reorganize, find quieter edges to operate from. And that thought stayed with me longer than the money, longer than the meeting, longer than the satisfaction of seeing them back down. A week after everything was resolved, life didn't go back to normal in the way I expected. It just got quieter in a strange, almost uncomfortable way, like a storm had passed, but the air still hadn't decided what temperature it was supposed to be. My truck was back where it always was, under that same old maple tree, but I found myself checking it more often than before, not because I thought it would disappear again, but because I realized how quickly something ordinary can get taken away and turned into leverage by people who know how to bend rules faster than most of us even notice them being bent. The HOA board stopped sending messages. Iron Gate stopped calling. And for a moment, it really did feel like the system had corrected itself, like a bruise fading rather than a wound being healed. But what stayed with me wasn't the money or even the confrontation. It was the realization of how fragile permission really is when it's controlled by people you never actually agreed to trust. One evening, I ran into Linda Park, one of the HOA board members, in the parking lot while she was loading groceries into her car, and she didn't look at me right away, just kept arranging bags like she was avoiding a conversation she knew was already waiting for her. Then she finally sighed and said, almost quietly, "You know, it wasn't supposed to be like that. They pushed the towing company on us, said it would keep things organized." There was no anger in her voice, just exhaustion, the kind people get when they realize they were part of something they didn't fully understand until it was too late. I didn't argue with her. I just said, it still needed notice, and she nodded, because deep down she already knew that. That moment stuck with me because it wasn't a villain confessing. It was just a person realizing how easily policy becomes a shield for bad decisions when nobody slows down long enough to question it. A few weeks later, I got a letter from the city, not dramatic, just official, confirming that Iron Gate Towing was under review for multiple complaints across different properties, and that Willow Creek Estates had been instructed to revise its enforcement procedures to comply with state law. No headlines, no celebration, just paperwork quietly shifting the boundaries of what they could and couldn't do. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading that letter thinking about how strange it is that most accountability doesn't look like justice in movies. It looks like forms, deadlines, compliance checks, and people slowly backing away from systems that suddenly got too expensive to defend. But even then, I didn't feel like I had won anything in the way people like to frame these stories. Because the truth is I still had to live there, still had to park my truck, still had to pass that same HOA sign every day. Only now I knew exactly how thin the authority behind it really was. And that knowledge changes the way you move through places, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like you've seen the wiring behind the wall, and you can't fully forget it. The final twist came about 2 months later when a new notice appeared on the community board, this time written very carefully, almost overly polite, outlining a revised towing policy that required written notice, documented violations, and a mandatory waiting period before any enforcement action could be taken. And I'll admit, seeing those words felt like a small kind of closure, not because it fixed everything, but because it proved something could be forced to change when enough pressure is applied in the right direction. Still, I sometimes think about how easily it all started, just an empty parking spot and a sign that appeared overnight, and how something so small almost turned into something far worse if I had just paid and walked away without asking questions. That's the part that stays with me more than anything, not the confrontation, not the payout, but the reminder that most systems like this only work as long as people assume they can't be questioned. And maybe the most uncomfortable truth in all of it is that there are probably other places right now, other lots, other buildings, where the exact same thing is happening to someone who is standing there confused in the morning light, holding keys to a car that isn't where it's supposed to be. So if there's anything I learned, it's this: not everything that looks official is actually lawful, and not everything that feels permanent is actually protected. And now I want to ask you something directly. What would you have done if you were in my position? Would you have paid and walked away? Or would you have pushed back the way I did? Because honestly, I still think about that choice more than I think about anything that came after it. If you've ever had an experience with towing, HOA disputes, or something that felt like a system was working against you, I'd genuinely like to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real-life stories like this where ordinary situations turn into unexpected fights for fairness, make sure to like and subscribe, because there are a lot more stories out there that never get told until someone decides to push back.